Welcome back. Now to our next conversation. Now, we want to get a sense of trade between Africa and other continents in 2022 and get an outlook for commodity exports in 2023 from Africa. We have Ted George now, Chief Narrative Officer at Cleos Advisory. Join us via Zoom. Great to have you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Good to be back.
So how was 2022 for Africa trade? We know we saw, sky-high prices for commodities in 2022. Was that a good thing for Africa, or was it a bad thing?
Well, it's a real mixed bag, and it depends which country you were. I think certainly for the oil and gas exporters, if we're looking at West Africa, particularly Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire, they saw a surge in revenues and demand for their exports, and that really swelled the export account. But that's been heavily offset by the fact that the imports of refined products have massively increased in price. And so that's really eaten away a lot of this gain. It's not entirely clear, how much actually Africa has benefited from this increase in prices, but the disruption has been a big problem. And if you bear in mind, like even the cash crop exporters of things like coffee and cocoa, which were very high prices, they saw a huge increase in their own energy costs and the cost of things like fertilizer. So really, I think overall Africa has suffered like the rest of the world, and there's very high prices that we're still dealing with.
Winners and losers in West Africa in terms of energy exports, because now we're hearing, that oil companies there having to pay that windfall tax.
Exactly. Well, there will certainly be some benefits for certain governments which see huge exports of hydrocarbons, so particularly Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire, but also all across Africa. But I think the real problem has been on the import front. The fact is there are relatively few operational refineries in Africa. Certainly, they don't produce nearly enough product for the entire continent, and so trying to get hold of these imports has been incredibly difficult ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you take a country like Senegal, it was getting over half of its petroleum products and probably over half of its fertilizer from either Russia or Ukraine. All of that was disrupted. So just trying to find replace these products is difficult. Prices have gone up for everyone. So I think overall, even though we're seeing this windfall tax, I think across the economies of Africa, the pain has been felt by these high energy import costs.
And how was West Africa coped with, high food prices from 2022 even till now?
Well, it's been extremely difficult. I mean, we saw food prices rise by a further 50% in the first half of last year, and they were already incredibly high. And so that really hurts, particularly the poorest households, which tend to spend over half their money on food. We've seen a real easing of prices in the last quarter. That's not surprising, partly because of an expectation of recession. But I think generally speaking, it's really hurt a lot of the economies. And there's a lot of questions now about the level of nutrition all across the world. So I think certainly for local producers of produce, they've been okay. Some of the harvests have been decent, certainly in West Africa this year. But I think all across the board, everyone's really feeling the pain of the high food prices.
And what about the cash crop exporters? How did they fare in 2022?
Well, I think if you look at cocoa and coffee, for example, they surged to really high prices. Cocoa is still very high as well. And that certainly really helped. It helped countries like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana to keep that high fixed farm gate price. But if you bear in mind the cost of fertilizer, it's roughly doubled the amount for a farmer to fertilize a field. And for a lot of them, they either pay for fertilizer or they pay school fees. And a lot of them, instead of paying school fees, there's a lot less fertilizer. It means a smaller crop next season. So I think the thing is, even though some of these cash crop exporters have really benefited from higher prices, they've really been hurt by these things like higher input costs.
What are you seeing for cocoa and coffee exports in 2023?
Well, look, the outlook's good so far. It's been a very strong start to the season. As far as we can see, cocoa exports are either at the same level or up on last season, which was very good across West Africa. But I think there's a real concern what will happen in what they call the light or the mid crop, which comes up from around March. And that's where we're going to see the impact of, let's say, lower use of fertilizer and inputs. So it's a strong outlook. Prices are strong as well. But the real thing about cocoa and coffee as well, it all comes down to demand, particularly in developed markets. And if we have a real recession biting there, that could drop demand for these commodities and we could see the prices falling. So a good outlook, but uncertain as always when it comes to prices.
Yeah, still so much uncertainty for 2023. But in recent months, the EU has issued new ESG regulations regarding imports of African commodities to the EU. How significant are these? And which commodities are in the crosshairs?
Well, I think they're very significant indeed. I mean, we had COP27 last year looking at the climate, COP15, which finished in December, which was looking specifically at biodiversity. And these are the big issues coming through into 2023. We've seen a lot of pledges and regulations out there about ending deforestation by 2030. All of the soft commodity sectors are linked to that, livestock as well as things like cocoa and coffee. We've also seen a real focus as well from the EU on introducing carbon taxes. That's not just for things like oil and gas and minerals. They're also talking about some agricultural products linked to deforestation, like cocoa, for example. That could completely change the economic model. And there's a broad also effort to try and end all imports to the EU, which are linked either to deforestation or to human rights abuse. That's potentially the entire commodity value chain. So there's very radical legislation coming in, and it directly affects a lot of exporters of commodities in Africa who export into the EU. So there's a lot that needs to be taken on board, and this search for a way to prove you have sustainable supply chains is going to become critical to Africa this year.
All right, let's hope Africa gets it right, with trade in 2023. Thank you so much, Ted George, Chief Narrative Officer, Kleos Advisory. Thank you so much. Enjoy the weekend.
Good.